I remember hating school as a kid, and I didn't start feeling even a little better about it until my senior year of high school. I never thought I'd end up studying nursing in college. It was really stupid of me to have accepted it so easily. Every time I think about it, I curse my stupid counselor. Of course, I should blame my mom too, but I don't really want to. Mom wanted me to be a nurse. When I told my counselor, she smiled and said, "Do you really think you're going to be accepted with this score?" Then she added, "Just to make your mom happy, list nursing as one of your options and tell her you applied. But don't worry, you won't get in." I listened to him, and now I'm a nurse, out of sheer luck. At first, I thought that accepting a nursing position in this remote village would make it easier for me to eventually transfer to a hospital in the city. But once I got here, I realized how wrong I was. Now, I have to spend 8 to 10 hours a day in this clinic until the end of the year. The clinic was small and empty, with almost no facilities. The buildings were separate from each other, surrounding a courtyard, and the plaster on the walls was peeling away. The benches were metal and rusty. The emergency room was the worst, a tiny, cramped space without even a proper table or chairs. Instead, it had 2 old benches, like the ones from a school classroom, so uncomfortable they made sitting unbearable. We had applied for funding many times, but no one paid the slightest attention. It felt as if they were just waiting for the clinic's roof to collapse on us before they would finally mourn our fate. Worst of all, the clinic was right next to the village cemetery. Every day, there were new stories about ghosts haunting the place, making it even more unsettling to keep working there. I often thought about leaving, returning to the city and doing freelance work instead. I was certain no one would care about the absence of a nurse. After all, no one seemed to care about my job now. But when I spoke to the few people in the village who understood how dire the situation was, they told me that most villagers avoided the clinic altogether. Instead, they traveled to surrounding villages or nearby cities for treatment, unwilling to step foot in a place so neglected. I was reviewing patient records, and with each file I read, I felt a growing sense of sorrow. I was completely absorbed in my notes when I suddenly heard someone call out, "Nurse Mary?" It was a woman's voice. I assumed it was one of the patients who had either returned for something they had forgotten or needed further assistance. When I heard Nurse Mary again, I got up from the bench and walked to the office door. I glanced around the clinic, but there was no one in sight. "Nurse Mary?" I stared at the empty hallway in confusion. Maybe the voice had come from outside, I thought. Moving toward the clinic entrance, I caught sight of a woman approaching. She appeared pregnant and in need of help. Every time she called my name, I responded, "Yes? Where are you? Who are you?" But she never answered, only repeated my name. Just as I was about to step outside to find her, she called me again. I had forgotten to mention, only a general doctor and I worked at the clinic. But on Tuesdays and Thursdays he traveled to another village, leaving me completely alone. And that day was Tuesday. A small sense of unease crept over me, but I quickly dismissed it. I had never believed in the ghost stories surrounding the clinic, and I wasn't about to start now. I walked to the clinic door and peered outside. It was open, yet no one was there. Still, I stepped outside, scanning the street. The scorching afternoon sun beat down, and not a single soul was in sight. Maybe I was just exhausted, I told myself. Fatigue could play tricks on the mind. I longed to go home, to leave the rest of my work for tomorrow. With that decision, I turned back inside to grab my phone and belongings. But I had barely taken a few steps when, bang, the clinic door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, staring at it. No wind, no movement, no explanation. I wanted to convince myself it was just a draft, but there was none. Still, I forced myself to ignore it and walked back to my office. I packed my things and hurried out of the office. When I tried to open the door, the lock stuck for a moment, but with some effort, I managed to turn it. Once outside, I locked up behind me. The street was as silent and empty as it had been a few minutes ago. I started walking home, eager for a warm meal and a few hours of escaping into a romantic movie. Something to shake off the unsettling feeling still lingering in my chest. I reached my house quickly and slid the key into the lock. But when I tried to turn it, it wouldn't budge. It was as if the key wasn't fitting, or something was jammed inside. Frowning, I tried again, twisting harder. Just as I applied more force, snap. The key broke in the lock. A frustrated sigh escaped me as I stared at the closed door. How am I supposed to get inside now? I turned, glancing toward my neighbor's house, thinking of asking for help. But before I could take a step, a voice, soft, familiar. Nurse Mary. I froze. My heart slammed against my ribs. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. No one was there. One of the village women stood behind me, holding a piece of cake in her hand. She chuckled and asked, "What's wrong?" Not wanting to explain what had happened at the clinic, I simply said, "It was too hot in there. I couldn't stay any longer, so I came home." I glanced up at the scorching sun above us and wiped the sweat from my forehead. "Isn't it unbearably hot today? I'm drenched." She laughed and shook her head. "We're used to this heat. We bake bread and desserts in this weather, and the men work under the blazing sun all day." Then she handed me the dish. "I baked some cake today. I hope you like it." I smiled and thanked her before sighing. "The key broke inside the lock, and now I can't get into the house." She glanced at the door, then nodded. "My son can fix it." A few minutes later, she returned with her son, who carried a screwdriver and a hammer, ready to help. He asked me what had happened, and I held up the broken key. "It must have broken because of the heat," he said. I pointed to the door. "Can you open it for me?" He nodded. "Of course I can." He stepped forward and began unscrewing the lock. Within a few minutes he had the door open. Then he left briefly and returned with a spare lock he had at home. He installed it quickly, and I was finally able to enter the house. As he was about to leave, I took some money from my purse and handed it to him. His face lit up with happiness, and a smile spread across his mother's lips. "Thank you again," I said sincerely. They both nodded and left. I went into the kitchen, took the food out of the fridge, and put it on the stove to warm it up a little. Then I stepped out of the kitchen, turned on the TV, and sat on the couch, watching my favorite channel. Suddenly a voice echoed through the house. "Your food is burning." I froze, my heart pounding. I looked around, but no one was there. The voice had come from the kitchen. I rushed back inside, but the room was empty. A strong smell of burning food filled the air. My eyes darted around the kitchen. There was no one. The voice had come from somewhere around me, but there was no sign of anyone. "Who are you? Where are you? Why don't you show yourself? What do you want from me?" I called out. Silence. I asked again, my voice shaking, but the only response was the eerie stillness of the house. I glanced around nervously. There was nowhere to hide, and yet I couldn't see anyone. My body had started to react, my heart was pounding, and my palms were damp with sweat. I took a bottle of water from the fridge, took a sip, and nodded to myself, as if trying to reassure my own thoughts. I sank onto the floor near the stove, my head throbbing, my mind clouded with confusion. I couldn't make sense of what was happening around me. Who was calling me? Was I imagining things? Was I losing my mind in this isolated village? No, I refused to believe it. I had spent 27 years of my life without believing in anything supernatural. I wasn't going to start now, especially not in a place like this, alone. I told myself firmly, "No, you're just exhausted. It's nothing. Just your mind playing tricks on you." There was no way anything strange had happened. It was all just a stupid illusion. But even as I tried to convince myself, my appetite had completely disappeared. I went to my room, and I fell asleep quickly. But it wasn't long before an anxious girl's voice called out to me repeatedly. "Nurse! Nurse!" The voice came from outside, insistent and urgent, pulling me from my sleep. I wanted to wake up immediately, to see what was wrong, but my body felt impossibly heavy, like a weight was pressing down on my chest. It was as if I were sleeping on a rock. Finally, with great effort, I forced my eyes open. I stumbled toward the window, rubbing my tired eyes. The girl outside hesitated before asking, "Did you wake up?" I groaned, still disoriented. What's going on? What happened? A sharp headache pulsed in my temples, and I struggled to take a deep breath under the lingering weight in my chest. My stomach churned uneasily, making me feel even worse. "My brother fell off his bike. He's bleeding from the arms and legs," she said hurriedly. "I went to the clinic, but you weren't there, so I had to come here." I shook off the dizziness and straightened up. "Go to the clinic," I told her. "I'm coming now." I still had a headache, and sleep clung to my eyes. It seemed I had reached a new level of exhaustion. I shook my head and pressed my eyelids together several times, trying to force them open completely. A sharp pain shot from my forehead to the back of my neck, and my body felt utterly drained. I poured myself a glass of water in the kitchen, took a deep breath, and made my way to the clinic. When I arrived, a young boy sat outside with his mother, his hands and feet covered in scrapes. I quickly unlocked the clinic door and led them inside. Without wasting time, I cleaned and bandaged his wounds. As I finished, his mother suddenly spoke up, her voice pleading. "Nurse Mary, please don't leave our village. We need a nurse here." I looked at her in surprise. "How did you know I wanted to leave?" She sighed. "Every nurse who comes to our village leaves after a few months." I removed my gloves and reached into the drawer, pulling out a small pack of biscuits. Handing it to the boy, I gently asked him to step outside so I could speak with his mother alone. So I wasn't hallucinating. The nurses before me had all heard something, had all experienced something. I swallowed hard. "But what about the doctor, or any of the villagers?" She lowered her head, avoiding my gaze. "No doctor, no villagers," she murmured. "Only nurses." She looked at me and said, "Come with me." It was already dark outside when I followed her. She led me to the cemetery near Nardic Clinic. As we stepped past the iron gate, a deep chill settled in my bones. The silence was heavy, disturbed only by the sound of our footsteps on the dry earth. After a short walk, she stopped by a grave. The name on the worn tombstone was barely legible under the moonlight. "A few years ago," she began, her voice heavy with sorrow, "one of the village women died due to the negligence of a nurse during childbirth. Since then, every nurse who comes here eventually leaves." I swallowed hard. "And the nurse, what happened to her?" She hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully, but before she could answer, the boy called for his mother. She sighed, giving the grave one last look before turning away. I stood there for a moment, staring at the stone, the weight of her words sinking in. Back at the clinic, I began packing my things, my mind clouded with unanswered questions. Just then the voice returned. "Nurse Mary." This time there was no fear in me. I turned toward the unseen presence and spoke firmly. "You are taking revenge on the innocent people of this village, not the nurse who wronged you." A heavy silence filled the clinic. I continued, my voice unwavering. "Whether you do it willingly or not, you are bringing fear and suffering to people who had nothing to do with what happened to you. Innocent people have died, haven't they?" The air around me felt thick, as if the entity was listening, absorbing my words. I picked up my bag and stepped out of the clinic. I had made my decision. I would stay. Not for the ghost, not for fear, but for the people of this village. They needed help, and I would not abandon them.